Well, Eskom says it's hoping to downgrade load shedding to stage 4 from tomorrow. South Africans have been facing stage 5 and 6 power cuts recently because of further breakdowns of generating units. Eskom says it will also provide its outlook for the next week in due course.
To then indicate that as we foreseen for tomorrow, we will revert to stage 4 load shedding, and hopefully by Saturday to stage 3. We will then assess the situation again to see units that have returned in order to also look at the next week outlook in terms of load shedding requirements and capacity availability. We're still sitting with high levels of unreliability, bringing it a component of unpredictability in terms of units breaking down. We will typically find that some days we can have 2 units being lost in that day, whereas the other day you will have 4 or 5 units being lost in that day, then creating for us difficulty in having adequate capacity.
We cannot afford to be running out of funds for diesel throughout this period. So at any given moment in time, we as the board, together of course with management, are looking at ways and means of making sure that we have the funding, because running those open cycle gas turbines is important for us to be able to provide and reduce the level or the stages of load shedding.
Come on, this we can speak to energy expert Hilton Trollip. A very good evening to you, Hilton. Thank you for your time tonight. So we've had another briefing today from the management at Eskom. There have been various things going on, including talk of the declaration possibly of a state of disaster in response to the energy crisis. How would you describe where we are in the crisis at this point?
Good evening, and thanks for inviting me to share my views. We are objectively in the same place as we were a week ago and 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago and a month ago, because essentially nothing has really changed in the real world. The real world is Eskom's generation fleet, which, as they remind us, and they provide us very good empirical facts on their websites and in their reports. They've got this old, most of their fleet is old. There are 2 new power stations, but which between them have got 12 units. But of those 12 units, most of them aren't working. And the others are poorly designed. So the clip you had there of the Eskom, I think that was the generation manager. The 2 words are unreliable and unpredictable. And the other one is old. And so that's the hardware. We've got at any stage, these days, the thing that's not changing is about half of Eskom's 90 units, these huge big machines, at any stage are out of action. Some of them for plant maintenance, so they get taken off the system to get serviced, like you get your car serviced. But most of them, if you use the car analogy, broken down on the side of the road. And that is, Eskom have told us now for quite some time that things will continue this way until we get new capacity, generating capacity onto the grid.
Right.
And the other thing that hasn't changed is we haven't heard from the only government department that is authorized to get new capacity onto the grid any change in their plans to get new capacity onto the grid. Instead, that ministry, the Minerals and Energy Ministry, has instead decided to interfere at Eskom, and they seem to be of the view that if they shout loud enough and stamp their feet loud enough, that they can get Eskom to do stuff that Eskom has not been able to do for the past 10 years.
And just on what you were talking about as far as the unreliability of the Eskom fleet at this point, just today in its forecast, the utilities not even able to give us any reliable prediction that can go beyond tomorrow, Friday, Saturday, and at best Sunday. That's where we are.
Absolutely, but the utilities are just giving us the facts. So I don't know if you know what a dartboard, if you think of a dartboard with 20 numbers on it and you're going to throw a dart, and somebody says, well, you've got a 1 in 20 chance of hitting 20 and you've got a 1 in 50 chance of hitting the bull. They're just telling us that. That's the statistics of reliability of that fleet, the coal-fired fleet. If we continue maintaining it like we are with the resources we have, the skills, the finance, the spare parts, and none of those can be ramped up very easily, the skills, the finance, or the spare parts. And in fact, ramping up the finance might be a big mistake because it's the same as having a car that's completely clapped out. The day comes where you've just got to scrap it. So hopefully by the time you scrap the car, you've made arrangements to get a new one. And in the case of power stations, you can't just go and buy a new one. It takes a few years to build them. So what we should be doing is we should be building power stations as fast as possible, and no reputable research organization or institution will tell you that it's the fastest, the quickest, and the cheapest power stations to build at this stage.
So Hilton, with that in mind, Hilton, I'm curious to get your thoughts. I'm keen, in fact, to get your thoughts on government suggestion, or at least the ANC's suggestion after its Lekgotla this past weekend, that in fact, within 12 months, this is a problem that may actually be resolved, even going as far as saying, the state of disaster declaration, if it happens, would allow us to fast-track that process. Is that realistic?
So, Timbukile, that's what they said, but there was no more detail. They didn't say how or why. They didn't say which law the state of disaster would change. In my view, we have all the laws we need. We have all the institutions we need. We need people to stick to the law. So at Eskom, we need to put an end to the corruption and the mismanagement going on, and that's a breaking of the law. At the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, we need the Mineral Resources and Energy Minister to comply with the Electricity Regulation Act, which requires him to have a plan for new generation, which he doesn't. So we've got all the laws we need. Fikile Mbalula, he used to be Minister of Transport, and possibly the only good thing about him becoming ANC Secretary General is that he's no longer in charge of transport, because I've just been doing an analysis, and we're going a bit off the topic here, of Transnet Freight Rail, which is in a disaster. And there too, it's all just talk. It's no details. I don't think Fikile Mbalula ever understood how a railway network worked. I don't think he's the person who from the ANC is talking about the state of disaster and 12 months. I'd love to sit with Fikile of an evening, over a cup of tea, and chat about power stations and power systems. And, I spent 30 years lecturing in this subject, and I've studied it my whole life. So I've got a fairly sort of calm, objective view about it. I'd love to hear what Fikile Mbalula knows about a power system or a power station.
Well, to be fair,
I suspect nothing.
In all fairness, it's not just the ANC Secretary General's view, because even the president of the party in the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, made a similar comment. Just on what you were talking about as far as the coming months, Mr. Conradi said today that at the moment they've secured funding for outages scheduled up to August this year, but Eskom is short of funding for outages after that. You also have news from the board that while this 12 months is being bandied about, they are still sticking to their timeline of 24 months, basically a 2-year period. If a state of disaster is declared, it would no doubt be very expensive in funding the response, would it not?
So I don't think throwing money at this problem will help, quite frankly, because if you throw a whole lot of money at Eskom, it's not going to solve the skills problem. The kind of skills that you need in Eskom are people with highly skilled that work in teams and know the plant that they're working on. So it's not going to get new skills. It's not going to speed up the procurement processes. And by trying to speed up those procurement processes, already there's a lot of corruption and mismanagement in those. It's not going to get better coal from the corrupt coal suppliers, which is damaging the plants. So, yeah, you see, it's difficult to comment on a plan which has no details other than we're going to have a state of disaster and it'll speed stuff up. But they haven't said how. And, you know, I'd like to hear if they did know how, I bet you, they'd be telling us. They'd say, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. But they don't know how. So I think they're political statements coming from a group of politicians that have seen the writing on the wall that there's going to be load shedding up until the next election. And unfortunately, the real state of disaster is what's happening to the economy, what's happening to poor households, what's happening to poverty, what's happening to unemployment because of load shedding. And I think that these statements of general big solutions, such as a state of disaster, is hot air. And I'm worried about it because who knows what will happen after we saw the state of disaster, which, by the way, I agreed with for COVID. That was an external threat that we didn't understand. In a pandemic, we didn't know about that virus. It was very correct to stop transmission of that while we found out. But there's no external threat here. The only threat is continued management from government side by people that, frankly, have demonstrated incredibly consistent, poor performance and very little understanding of what's needed of the problem and very little understanding, no understanding of what's needed to solve it, apart from statements from, for example, Gwede Mantashe saying, we need a fixer, just one person to go in and fix Eskom. I don't believe that.
Hilton Trollip, good to speak to you as always. Thank you for your time on News at Prime tonight.